This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign for a free sample of the first chapter. That's fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 291. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. I'm excited to share today's episode with you, as always. One of the reasons why I'm particularly excited to share today's episode is because today's episode marks 5 years of Fertility Friday. Yay! This is actually Fertility Friday's podcast anniversary, or however I should say it. It's a made-up word anyways. But just about 5 years ago, today is when the first episode of Fertility Friday dropped. So every year I do a bit of an anniversary show. But today I decided, instead of reflecting on the year, I decided to do an episode to address some of the questions that I have been receiving the absolute most within the last couple of months. So today's episode is all about postpartum charting. My DMs are full, my Facebook messages are full, my Fertility Friday Facebook group is full of questions about postpartum charting. And so I won't be able to answer every single possible question that you might have if you do have questions about postpartum charting, but this episode will definitely go in depth into what you need to know when you are planning to use fertility awareness in the postpartum period. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. So today we're talking all about postpartum charting. And when I was preparing for this episode, as I mentioned, I've had just an explosion of questions about postpartum charting in my DMs, in my Facebook messages, via email, in my Facebook group. And so in addition to that, I actually posted in my Facebook group a question, tell me all your questions about postpartum charting. So we'll be talking about postpartum charting in there. If you're not yet in the Fertility Friday Facebook group, you'll find us over at fertilityfriday.com/community. And today's episode I've structured based on the questions. So I've divided the episode into sections. We'll be talking about the return of fertility postpartum. We'll be talking about taking your temperature, BBTs. We'll be talking about cervical mucus, as well as using fertility awareness for birth control and conception in the postpartum period. And I thought a really good place to start and to anchor our discussion is to jump in and start addressing some of the myths about postpartum charting. So the first myth about postpartum charting is that fertility awareness does not work and will not work. And that is a myth because fertility awareness charting can and does work. The challenge is that it doesn't necessarily work for all women in the same way. When you're charting postpartum, you go from when you're cycling normally, have a period, and then eventually you approach ovulation, and then you ovulate, and then about 2 weeks later you get your period, and repeat. Even though it's not always exactly the same day that ovulation occurs on, even if your cycles are a little bit irregular, you're still cycling. And so that makes postpartum charting very different because for many women, their first ovulation and period doesn't return. If they're breastfeeding, it may not return for 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 months. That's a huge range of time. And so it means, the way I look at it is that you're experiencing just an incredibly long preovulatory phase. And so that makes charting different. And so it means that you have to rely primarily on cervical mucus when you're using the symptothermal method, because until you ovulate, the temperature doesn't help you at all, because the temperature has no predictive value. So for that reason, for some women, it's going to be a bit of a challenge depending on their mucus patterns, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But for many women, this method will work, provided that they take the time to learn how to understand and interpret their cervical mucus as per the fertility awareness method, specifically for how it works postpartum. So the myth is that it doesn't work. The truth is that it can work, but it's a different type of charting. And so for my recommendation for most women who are wanting to use fertility awareness for birth control is to consult an instructor during this time, so that you can just really gain that confidence. Because a lot of women who use fertility awareness charting aren't necessarily that comfortable with charting, interpreting, understanding their cervical mucus. So when you're in the postpartum phase, it becomes key with symptothermal methods of fertility awareness charting. And for that reason, it's just really important to seek support so that you can really gain that confidence and use the method effectively and accurately. Another myth that I wanted to touch on is the myth that breastfeeding is birth control. And so breastfeeding can and does suppress ovulation and can certainly delay the return of your fertility. And for many women, it definitely does. But it's not necessarily predictable. There's a fairly significant range of time in terms of when your ovulation and your menstruation will return. Some women may get their first period back around the 3 or 4 month mark, whereas others are around the 6 or 7 month mark. And other women may get their periods back for the first time between, months 8 and 12. And other women don't get their periods back even beyond the 1 year mark. And so with that said, it's helpful to understand the role that breastfeeding plays. And so the more skin-to-skin contact that you have, the more frequently that you breastfeed, or the more milk that you're producing, can certainly have a suppressive effect on ovulation. But when you're wanting to actively avoid pregnancy for a period of time, it's helpful to blend that understanding of how breastfeeding can suppress the cycle with an actual method of fertility awareness charting that involves daily observations of your cervical mucus patterns, so that you can be really sure that you can identify when your fertility does return postpartum. And one interesting myth that I talk about whenever I have a chance is that you can't get pregnant before your first period. Now, I think any woman who charts her cycles with fertility awareness is well aware that the event that happens before your first period is ovulation. And so it's absolutely possible postpartum to get pregnant before you have had your first period. And the reason for that is because before you have your first period, ovulation is going to happen. And so when you're charting your cycles, when you're paying close attention to your cervical fluid, you can pick up on your very first ovulation, which is basically the whole point of postpartum charting, by checking for cervical mucus every single day, getting into the habit of really doing that. And when you are approaching ovulation, you would expect to see your cervical fluid. So you'd expect to see it. And for many women, pregnancy can actually rejuvenate the cervical crypt. So I've worked with a number of clients who came off the pill and they saw cervical mucus, but maybe not a lot of the clear stretchy mucus, or not in a high quantity. But for many women postpartum, they actually see more and see it more clearly during their fertile window. So however it appears for you, when you go into your fertile window postpartum, you will see a shift from your basic infertile pattern, which we'll talk a little bit about, to your mucus pattern. And that is how you identify when your fertility has returned and when you're back into a regular ovulatory cycle. And so with that said, because ovulation happens before you'll see your first period, there are women for whom, they are postpartum and they have sex that one time and then they get pregnant, but they never had their period first. They actually got pregnant on their first cycle. So definitely a possibility. So I've already touched a little bit on the return of fertility postpartum. And this is one of the questions that I get a lot. When will my period come back? Why did my period come back sooner? I know some friends, their period didn't come back for a year. Why did mine come back after 3 months? So there's lots of questions around the return of fertility. And I think the most challenging aspect of it, and it's similar to fertility awareness in general, is that you can't predict exactly when your period is going to return postpartum. So that is just not something that you can really predict with accuracy until you start to see those fertile signs. And so I think that, the most important factor, or one of the most significant factors that's going to determine when your period is going to return postpartum, is whether or not you are able to breastfeed. And so even if you have the best of intentions, go back and have a listen to episodes 118 and 119. Episode 118 features an interview with a friend and lactation consultant who shares her best information about breastfeeding. As well, episode 119 goes into postpartum charting a little bit and the impact of breastfeeding on your menstrual cycle and things like that. So it's a great episode to listen to alongside today's. But so breastfeeding would be key. So even if you have the best intentions, it's possible that you may encounter difficulties with breastfeeding. And so depending on whether or not you're able to breastfeed will be the first factor to determine how quickly your period will return. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not able to breastfeed and your milk supply eventually dries up shortly after you give birth, then it is absolutely possible and likely that your period will return quite quickly, even faster than you imagined. So you can ovulate again within weeks of giving birth if you're not breastfeeding, just so that you know that. And if you've ever heard of Irish twins, that's the word for having 2 babies in one 12-month period. And that is a real thing because of how quickly your fertility can return postpartum. So that's one of the factors. And then if you are able to breastfeed, as I touched on a little bit earlier, how frequently you breastfeed, whether you're doing it on demand or whether you've put your baby on a schedule, how much skin-to-skin contact you get throughout the day, all of those factors will influence how long ovulation will be suppressed. And whether you're supplementing your breast milk with formula can play a role, whether your baby's sleeping through the night can play a role. And so initially, those are the types of factors that can determine whether or not your ovulation is suppressed for a longer period of time or shorter period of time. So the longest suppressive effects of breastfeeding are typically seen in women who are feeding on demand, who are exclusively only feeding breast milk, and who are doing lots of skin-to-skin contact. And so basically, you're just in contact with your baby most of the time, and you're breastfeeding as requested, and that's the only source of baby's nutrition. Now, this is not a judgment because I have breastfed 2 babies, and I know how challenging, difficult, and painful it can be. So it's not to say that there's a right way or a wrong way. It's just saying quite literally that the more exposure that you have, the more babies put on the breast, the more likely you're going to have that higher level of suppressive effect. So when you're breastfeeding, you're producing prolactin. When you breastfeed, you release oxytocin. The hormones that you produce during the process of breastfeeding, they do have this suppressive effect on ovulation. Now, depending on the duration of breastfeeding per child, you can breastfeed your child for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and beyond. And so as you reach different milestones and stages, that can also affect how long it's going to take for your ovulation and your period to return. So, for example, for some women, when they start to introduce solid foods, the baby may end up drinking less breast milk. And for some women, that change and transition may coincide with when their period is returning. For some women, they may find that when their baby starts sleeping longer stretches throughout the night, etc., but basically baby's feeding less frequently or drinking less milk overall, some women may find that their cycles returning coincide with that event. Now, other women continue, even if their baby is sleeping through the night and they are eating solid foods, some women continue not to have ovulation and their period return for a period of time. So it's helpful to know the different factors that can impact when your first ovulation and your menstruation, when your periods will come back again. So some of those factors are related to babies feeding and sleeping and those types of things. And there are also individual differences that are separate from these external factors. So for some women, just they may be more sensitive to that shift when you change to solid foods and babies suckling less frequently. And for other women, they may be less sensitive to those types of changes. And for women who are in the postpartum stage and they are wanting to get their periods back sooner, they're wanting to start trying to conceive again, I think there's a few things that are just helpful to keep in mind. If you're in the postpartum period and you know that you're planning to conceive shortly, then it is really helpful to start thinking about preconception nutrition, nutrient repletion, to really start thinking about and focusing on replenishing the nutrients that you used the first time around when you were pregnant. And so just from that most basic standpoint, making sure that you are, consuming enough food to offset the demands of breastfeeding, ensuring that you're getting enough protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So I think one of the most basic things, and as a mom of two, it's not always easy to get in those 3 meals a day. It's not always easy to put yourself first, especially when you have a brand new baby who needs your attention 24 hours a day and mostly at night. And so when you're thinking about, okay, what can I do to bring my period back? How can I get this kick-started? Then it's really helpful to go back to those basics and ensure that you are getting enough to eat every single day and that you do start to focus back on preconception nutrition. So you're for many women in the postpartum phase, you're balancing postpartum nutrient repletion with preconception care. And so that it's something to really keep in mind. And so there's a few podcast episodes that I'll direct you to. Episode 126. So in that episode, it's my interview with Lily Nichols, and she talked about, eating for nutrient-dense breast milk, which is, of course, a controversial thing to talk about. Recently, one of the posts about that episode got picked up and there was a big discussion on it. But it's important to know that postpartum is a really important period where it is a good idea to focus on replenishing nutrients that we use during pregnancy. So there's a number of key nutrients that we require to make tiny human beings. And especially when you're planning to conceive again, we're balancing postpartum nutrient repletion with preconception planning. Another factor to consider is pregnancy spacing. And it's easy to underestimate how much pregnancy can take out of you and how long it may take your body to fully recover and for you to really replete those nutrients and kind of get back to that pre-pregnancy level. And when we look at what the research tells us about pregnancy spacing is that when women wait about 18 months, so when your child is 18 months old to then conceive your second child, a spacing duration of 18 months or more is associated with better outcomes. So it's possible in some cases that if your period and your ovulation haven't yet returned, it could be a sign that your body is still transitioning and gearing up to it. So it's something just to consider. One of the questions that kind of goes hand in hand with this discussion of how to get my period back postpartum, what are some of the things I can do to prepare for my next pregnancy is, when is it a problem? So at what point should I really be concerned that my period hasn't returned? My baby's now eating solid foods and sleeping through the night or not. But either way, it's been quite a while. And so what I would say is once you've passed, say that 15-month mark. That's even a bit on the later side, but I'm just being a bit generous because everybody is so different. But if you really pass that, say, 15 to 18-month mark and there's no signs of ovulation, then it's certainly time to consult with your doctor. It's certainly time to consider just doing some general testing. Make sure to have your thyroid looked at. You can get hormone panel done. Particularly if you're planning to conceive in the near future, you can have your doctor look at certain nutrient levels, including iron and B12 and vitamin D, et cetera. But ultimately, if you have no signs of your ovulation or period returning and you're already at the 15-month mark, somewhere between the 15-month and 18-month mark, it's time to book an appointment with your doctor or healthcare practitioner just for a general checkup to make sure that everything is all right. Now, let's get into some of the aspects of charting postpartum. I wanted to start by talking about temperature. And so when you're charting postpartum initially, before you have your first ovulation and menstruation, temperature is largely unhelpful, just for the record. And so, as I mentioned earlier, some women get their periods back sooner, after 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. But many women don't get their first ovulation and, their period doesn't return until 8 months or 9 months or 10 months or even longer than that. And so if you were taking your temperature every day for 10 months in this kind of extended pre-ovulatory phase, the temperature has no predictive value and it's really not helping you to identify when your fertility is returning before ovulation. So I think one of the challenges for many women who have used fertility awareness before they were pregnant is that postpartum charting is different. You go from having temperature as being one of your, if not the primary sign that you're looking out for, that's telling you when you've ovulated, so you know when you're in your post-ovulatory infertile phase. You go from having that kind of security blanket to not having it at all. So my advice postpartum is to rely on your cervical mucus as your primary sign of fertility. That would be the suggestion. And really and truly, because you don't know when your temperature is going to return, you could certainly take your temperature for a few days to get kind of like that baseline understanding, see where your temperatures are at and understand that. But until you start to see cervical mucus again, I don't think that it's that useful to take your temperature every single day. I mean, if you're wanting to monitor for potential thyroid or metabolism issues, then absolutely that would make sense. But for the purpose of charting and confirming your fertile window, until you actually see signs that ovulation may be returning, so your cervical mucus, I would say skip the temperature. So then that recommendation and advice then kind of throws a few things in the moot point in terms of like up late at night, all that kind of nighttime distractions. While if your temperature isn't providing you with useful information until your first ovulation, then it's better not even to take it because it's not even necessarily helping you. Now, not everyone may agree with this. There may be women who completely disagree with this. This is just based on my experience and my experience professionally as well as personally. So in my case, when I had my first son, I didn't ovulate again for the first time until month 8 postpartum. And so I did not take my temperature every day for 8 months because it would not have provided me with any useful information. So during that 8 months, I was actively checking and charting my cervical fluid every day. And that was the primary sign that I was relying on, just to kind of put that out there. Now, if you are in the postpartum period and your periods and ovulation have returned, and you still have the issue of obviously being up all night and not getting good sleep and not really being able to rely on the temperature, then there are a couple of options. So, I mean, if you are getting at least 5 hours of sleep a night in a row, then you can still take your temperature the normal way and just note any disruptions. For many women during this particular time of their lives, when their sleep is very disrupted, they do rely on certain devices wearable devices. So devices that you can sleep in, that measure your average sleep temperature, and really just give you a more stable graph to look at. And so not all women, I mean, this is why we have all these different options. So not all women are necessarily going to gravitate to all of these different options. But if you find yourself in the situation where you really do want to take your temperature every day, you are having a bit of a challenge with sleep disturbances and not really being able to understand your charts, especially during the postpartum period, then you may want to consider a wearable device like the Tempdrop, for example. The benefit of a device like that is that it will measure your temperature throughout the night as you sleep and provide you with an average, which from what I've seen on the temperature graphs really it organizes the temperatures to make them more readable. So when you do see your natural thermal shift, so after ovulation, when your temperature rises, it's often easier to interpret the temperatures on the graph. And so the downsides are that many of these devices are programmed with algorithms. So the computer is adjusting the temperature accordingly. So not all women are comfortable with that. And also, it's not measuring your basal body temperature. It's measuring your average sleep temperature. So when you have a device that's calculating your temperature at different points throughout the night and then spitting out an average at the end, it's not giving you a reading of your basal body temperature. So if you did have concerns about your thyroid or metabolism or, anything of that nature, then that temperature that you're getting wouldn't be the way to measure that. I think for most women, for the purpose of just helping them to confirm the temperature shift at just that basic level, I think for that, then that's really what you're getting, and it can be very, very helpful. So I just, but I always think it's helpful to kind of understand how all these devices work, what they are doing and what they're not doing. Just popping into today's episode with some exciting news. I've just opened up a new time slot for the upcoming Fertility Awareness Mastery Live 10-week group coaching program. We now have a second group meeting at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We start on January 21st, and there's still a spot for you. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. Now let's jump back into today's episode. Now, moving on to cervical mucus. So when you're charting postpartum, cervical mucus becomes essential to identifying when your fertility is returning. So one of the things that I'll often say to my clients is that during that postpartum period, you are in mucus watch. You're waiting for your fertility to return. And so you're checking for mucus every single day throughout the day so that you can establish what's called your basic infertile pattern. And what that means is that for most of the time, day-to-day, on a day-to-day basis, there's going to be, so for some women, every single day is just going to be dry. So if they're checking for mucus every day, it's just going to be dry. For some women, they're checking for mucus every day postpartum. They might see a little bit of kind of milky or lotiony type cervical fluid every single day. And so what's step one in postpartum charting is actually checking your mucus every single day for a period of at least 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, I would say, so that you can establish what is typically happening on a day-to-day basis. And that will help you to understand the change when your body shifts into fertility. So when you shift into your fertile window. So the most basic and easy to interpret example of this would be if you're checking for mucus every day and you're basically dry all the time. So every single day you're dry. And then when you finally shift into your fertile window, so as you approach ovulation, then you start to see clear, stretchy mucus. I think that's like the easiest. And everybody postpartum wishes that was the way that it presented. In that type of a case, it's quite simple. Once you check for your 2 to 3 week period, you establish that, your basic infertile pattern is dry. And then whenever you see some cervical fluid, then you know that you have to consider those days to be fertile. So every time you see a shift and change and you start to see mucus, then you know, okay. And so for many women who successfully use fertility awareness postpartum, this is how they do it. And when they finally shift into their fertile window, they know that they can identify their first ovulation and they know when their first period is coming. And so using myself as an example, it was very obvious to me when I shifted finally into fertility because I had cervical mucus, whereas the rest of the days were dry, in my case for the most part. And when I shifted into my fertile window, it was very, very obvious that it was different to my normal basic infertile pattern. So that is something. However, with that said, not all women have such a straightforward pattern. And so this is where some of the complexity comes in. And this is why it's important postpartum, especially if you're having difficulty, checking your mucus, interpreting your mucus, or understanding how to identify the difference between fertile days and infertile days. This is why it's really helpful to work with an instructor. So some women have postpartum some degree of cervical fluid every day. For some women, they may have like a creamy cervical mucus discharge every single day. And for other women, they might actually have like a clear discharge every single day. So you're not fertile every single day. So then you would want to work with an instructor to help you differentiate between your mucus patterns. So you understand the difference between fertile and infertile, so that you understand how to identify then when you do go into your fertile window and which days that you would consider infertile, which days you can actually have sex on, unprotected, if you are trying to avoid pregnancy. And so with that being said, there are limitations to mucus-only methods when it comes to postpartum charting. And so, for example, for a woman who sees peak mucus every single day, meaning that every single day she sees mucus that is clear and stretchy. Well, when you're using a symptothermal method or a mucus-only method, you have to consider clear, stretchy mucus to be fertile. So for a woman who's seeing clear, stretchy mucus every day postpartum, she has to consider every single day fertile. Obviously, every single day isn't fertile, so that particular method isn't going to work for her. And so fortunately, there are other fertility awareness-based methods that bypass mucus. So for example, the Marquette method uses the Clear Blue Fertility Monitor, which actually monitors for the rise in estrogen as you approach ovulation. And so this is a method that has been tested. There's research on it. It's an established method of fertility awareness charting. And so during the postpartum period, for women who are having, an extreme amount of difficulty interpreting their mucus, or for women who are experiencing irregular mucus patterns such that it makes it impossible for them to use a traditional symptothermal or mucus-only method, then the Marquette model is actually a better option. Because if you're, like I said, if you're seeing clear, stretchy mucus every single day postpartum, the mucus methods don't help you to differentiate between the fertile days and the infertile days if every single day you're seeing clear, stretchy mucus. So that's something to know and to consider, because for many women in the postpartum period who are not interested in using hormonal methods and who are having a great deal of difficulty interpreting their cervical mucus, the Marquette method does offer them an additional way to do it without having to rely primarily on mucus, and also a way to handle it during a time when you can't primarily rely on your basal body temperature. If the Marquette method is new to you, make sure to check out episode 158, so fertilityfriday.com/158. In that episode, I interviewed Mary Lee Barron, and we talked all about Marquette. And I do have an episode coming in the new year where we will be going through and talking about Marquette specifically as it relates to the postpartum period. But it's helpful to know that there are different ways to do this. And it's also helpful to know that there are science-backed fertility awareness-based methods that can take you through the postpartum period, even in these challenging situations where you may not be able to use a mucus-only method. So let's talk a little bit about using fertility awareness for birth control during the postpartum period. And so the postpartum period in many ways is kind of like a transition period. So if you had to listen to my most recent Fertility Awareness Reality Series episode with Stephanie, we were talking about how to manage fertility awareness when you have just transitioned off birth control. So Stephanie had started the Fertility Awareness Mastery 10-week program right after she jumped off the birth control pill. And so she is, as I was interviewing her, she's still in this transition phase where her mucus patterns haven't fully normalized, where everything is definitely not predictable. And we talked about ways to manage during this transitional period. So for a woman who is, newly postpartum, so just had a baby, and one of the questions is, when do you start charting? So when you stop bleeding, so postpartum, the bleeding is referred to as lochia. So once the lochia has stopped, like once you've stopped bleeding, you can, depending on how you've healed and depending on how you feel, my recommendation is just to start checking for mucus. So when you're going to the bathroom, just start wiping and start checking for mucus. So you just want to get into the habit of it. Even if you're not able to do it perfectly, you're not able to write everything down every time or whatever the case, you do want to get in the habit of checking and just, what are you seeing? And try to get a sense of what is happening. And so step one is to establish that basic infertile pattern. You want to understand what you're typically seeing every day. Is it dry? Are you seeing some degree of mucus every day? What are you seeing on a day-to-day basis? So you really want to start. The first step is to understand that. And you have to give yourself enough time that you can really understand and describe what you're seeing typically on a day-to-day basis. So that would be the first step. Once you've established that pattern and what you're typically seeing every day, then you can start to, provided that the pattern makes sense to you, so provided that you are either seeing like having dry days or having some degree of like lotiony mucus, but provided that you are understanding what we would refer to as your basic infertile pattern, then that is the point from which you can really start using the method. And one of the challenges about the postpartum period is that it doesn't necessarily go in a straight line. So for example, if you had your first ovulation 6 months after you gave birth, then it's not to say that every single day is going to be dry until you start seeing mucus for the first time and go into ovulation. So it's not uncommon as you start to approach your first ovulation for you to start seeing waves of mucus. So it's not uncommon to be dry and dry and dry and then have a couple days of mucus. That doesn't necessarily lead to ovulation. And that can happen a few times. It can happen several times as you move towards your very first period. So the key to successful postpartum charting when you're trying to avoid pregnancy is really understanding your mucus patterns, regularly checking every day for mucus, writing it down, and so that you can really understand and interpret the difference between what's happening on a typical day-to-day and what happens when you transition into your fertile window. I would also say that when you're planning to use fertility awareness for birth control postpartum, if you're not comfortable with what I just said and what I just described, if that sounds hard or intimidating, or if you're in the midst of postpartum and you've really had a hard time identifying your mucus patterns, then I would highly recommend for you to work with an instructor. In order to be successful during the postpartum period, it is a different type of charting because you have to rely heavily on mucus. Although there's lots of different ways to chart, there's many different fertility awareness-based methods. Many of the women who I've worked with over the years who've used fertility awareness charting for even years at a time are primarily using the method in the post-ovulatory phase. So there's a lot of women who only have unprotected sex after they've confirmed ovulation with their temperatures. And so for women who have never learned how to navigate the pre-ovulatory phase, well, the postpartum period is a really long pre-ovulatory phase. So it does require a different type of charting and a different level of understanding when it comes to your mucus patterns. So that's something to really consider seriously. The other thing is that until you are actually comfortable and confident identifying the difference between fertile days and infertile days postpartum, then you're going to need some sort of backup method. So this is extremely important. So whether you're using condoms, whether you're using a diaphragm, whether you're using some combination of the two, or using withdrawal or using alternative sex, there has to be a backup, because for most women, as I mentioned, you're not necessarily going to have all dry days until you go into your fertile window. And so there are going to be many days where you might have unusual spotting for a day or two and then it goes away, or you might have, several days of clear stretchy mucus and then it goes away, and so for those times where you have to consider yourself fertile, you have to have a way to manage your fertility, just as you would if you were not postpartum and you were approaching ovulation and you had fertile days. Like, how would you manage those fertile days? So you really have to have a plan, a strategy, and my recommendation is to work with an instructor. And even if you are experienced or if you have worked with an instructor in the past, it's a really good idea to have a few follow-up sessions. So I've had a number of clients book sessions with me postpartum just to check in since they've actively charted previously. So it's a really good idea to just, get in there and get some support so that you can do this accurately and confidently and successfully. And one last thing that I'll mention kind of along these lines is I've spoken about the delay in your ovulation returning and how, different factors can affect that. But when your period returns, I think it's good to spend just a moment on what to expect. So if you think about it, when your period comes back postpartum, you haven't had a period likely for like a year or more. And so it's not uncommon for your first few cycles for all of the parameters not necessarily to fall in line. So what I mean by that is that the first time you have your ovulation and your period, it's not uncommon for the luteal phase to be a bit on the short side, especially those first few cycles postpartum. It's not uncommon for the first few cycles not to be like perfectly regular. So if you always had cycles around 30 days, it's possible that you get your first cycle back, and then you might go a little bit of time before you get your next cycle back, or you might have a few cycles in a row and then have like a really long one. So it's not uncommon for it to take several cycles before everything returns back to normal. And if you're still breastfeeding your child at this time and you have started to get your cycle back, there are factors that can affect ovulation, during this time as well. So for example, if you're breastfeeding, your schedule's pretty normal, and then your baby gets sick and all of a sudden you're feeding throughout the night like you did when they were really tiny babies, but you haven't done that for a while, it's possible that having like a cluster feeding session like that for several days could delay ovulation. And so it's helpful just to know that there's different factors that can impact your cycle. And so, not to freak out if your cycles aren't immediately back to what they were before, and to understand that if you're still breastfeeding, the duration, the frequency, all those types of things can still affect your cycles after they return. And then those are things that you have to take into consideration when you're charting. So when you're charting, it's never about predicting when ovulation is going to happen. It's always about observing every day and determining what to do based on what you saw that day. So that's really important, especially as your cycle returns postpartum, for you to really be in the mindset of, I can't predict ovulation. I just have to identify which days I'm fertile based on my observations. So switching over to trying to conceive, I talked a little bit about that before. I think that when it's very similar in the sense that, you're checking for mucus every day, and you would identify when you're fertile based on when you're seeing your mucus. One thing I'll mention is that, again, when you're in that postpartum phase and your period first returns, all of those parameters may not be optimal just yet. And so it's not a bad idea, if you have the ability to wait a little while, for you to wait until you have at least 3 cycles where your cycle parameters are relatively normal. So not necessarily perfect, because there's no such thing as a perfect cycle, but it's not a bad idea to wait until you have, 3 cycles in a row that are within the normal range, like 24 to 35 days, where you confirmed ovulation and your luteal phase was, at least 11 days or more type of thing. And so overall, the cycle looks fairly normal and typical. So it's not a bad idea to actually have that kind of in mind. Now, everyone is going to make the choice that's best for them, depending on what's happening in the situation. It's just to give you a little bit of context and information. If you're wondering, like, what should I do? Should I, my cycles came back, but I have some concerns about them. It's not a bad idea just to take a little bit of time, if you have the ability to do that, and wait until your cycles fall into a more typical pattern. So that was a lot. That was a lot of information. So just to recap what we talked about in today's episode, I started by talking about some of the myths of postpartum charting. I went into some detail about the return of fertility, and to give you an idea of what to expect when you're in the postpartum period in terms of when your period may return and how long it would return and when to be concerned about that. We talked about taking your temperature, the role of basal body temperature postpartum, which is very minimal until you get your first ovulation and period back. We also talked about cervical mucus and the important role that cervical mucus plays postpartum. We talked about what to do when you can't interpret your cervical mucus patterns effectively postpartum, seeking other methods as opposed to mucus-only methods. We also talked about using fertility awareness for birth control and conception in the postpartum period. And so I'm guessing that many of you still have questions. If you still have questions that I wasn't able to address on today's episode, make sure to jump into the Fertility Friday Facebook group, fertilityfriday.com/community, and we'll be talking about postpartum charting in there when this episode comes out. If you are looking for additional support, if you're somewhere on your own charting journey, or if you are in the postpartum period, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme to take a look at some of the programs that I offer. If you're looking for support in the postpartum period, as I mentioned, it's a really good idea to seek support from an instructor just so that you can get a really good handle on cervical mucus charting and really have that comfort and confidence identifying the difference between your fertile days and infertile days so that you can make this method work for you. So I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season. Many of us are busy with our families and traveling and doing all kinds of things. So I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.